Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Can you all hear me okay? All right. So I'm going to call my response to the book, which has the word responses in it, Responses to the Enlightenment, an exchange on faith, foundations, and community. I'm calling it Otherwise Than Beliefs, or Beliefs Otherwise. So it's my great pleasure to lead off discussion of the book whose publication we celebrate tonight. One reason it is such a great pleasure is because I have long-standing personal connections with both of the book's authors, and over the years I've come to hold their respective philosophical contributions in high regard. Hank Hart, of course, was my mentor at the Institute for Christian Studies from 1992 to 2002, and under his tutelage I received both my master's and doctorate degrees. I have continued to learn much from Hank since I promoted in 2002, and reading this book has been no exception to that rule. I have known Will Sweet since 2000 when he participated in a book symposium I chaired at the Congress of the Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Alberta on the essay collection Walking the Tightrope of Faith, Philosophical Conversations About Reason and Religion. That book was a follow-up to Search for Community in a Withering Tradition, Conversations Between a Marxian Atheist and a Calvinian Christian, the book that, we might say, started it all. So this is what Allison was referring to. This book, in a sense, is a third in a series of philosophers of religion engaging with Hank Hart's thoughts on the whole question of faith, belief, reason, etc. As witnessed in Walking the Tightrope of Faith, the highly unique conversation conducted between Hart and Kai Nielsen in Search for Community piqued the interest of many philosophers, including eventually Professor Sweet himself. The book we are celebrating today, then, can be seen as the third volume in a series of dialogues between Hank and a diverse array of philosophical interlocutors on the theme of faith and reason. That so many philosophers of so many different backgrounds have found it worth their effort to engage Hank's thoughts on the relationship between faith and reason is a testament to the original, insightful, challenging, unorthodox, and oftentimes vexing nature of his views on such matters as religion, faith, truth, belief, and the role these play in our ongoing efforts to achieve solidarity or community in the midst of intractable difference, including and especially religious difference. Responses to the Enlightenment is unique in this series of dialogues because it is the only one in which the contributors are both Christian. That being the case, one could be forgiven for thinking that, unlike Search for Community and Walking the Tightrope, this book would find the authors assuming the existence of a much greater degree of common ground. While not entirely incorrect, such an impression would still be seriously misleading. For in this volume, the different approaches that Hart and Sweet take toward the matters of both faith and reason turn out to be just as intractable as those that emerged 20 years earlier between the atheist Nielsen and the Christian Hart. Surely the situation is curious on its face, and I want to use the time I've been given here to unpack it a little bit. Here I will restrict my comments to the matter of beliefs, or more specifically, Hart and Sweet's beliefs about beliefs. I choose to start with beliefs because most, if not all, of the problems dealt with in this book radiate out from the way that both philosophers conceive of beliefs, i.e., what they both take beliefs to be. And just as a curious aside, there's no index entry in the book for beliefs, though I think it's one of the most important concepts in the book. Yeah, I guess you can't index something if it's on every page. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Up to a point, both thinkers agree about what beliefs are, but in the end, Sweet's understanding of beliefs is broader than Hart's. And this difference between them will prove decisive for their respective understandings of the role that beliefs play in the life of faith. I'm just going to move this a bit because the arm of the mic is blocking my view. In brief, both understand beliefs as propositional attitudes, but in addition to this, Sweet's conception of what beliefs are, unlike Hart's, includes expressive and practical and not just descriptive or cognitive dimensions. As I just mentioned, both Sweet and Hart understand beliefs to involve the assumption of a propositional attitude. That is, they are cases of a particular form of intellectual assent, involving the utterance of a proposition which states that such and such is the case. So this descriptive or cognitive dimension, saying that something is the case, is essential to what beliefs are. As I've already alluded, Sweet does not think that this cognitive or descriptive dimension exhaustively defines what beliefs are, but at the very least, beliefs incorporate this dimension. For Hart, beliefs so understood, i.e. cognitively or descriptively, are almost entirely inadequate for understanding what is involved in the life of faith. Faith, for Hart, is otherwise than belief, so understood. For him, the life of faith is not defined by its beliefs, but rather the proof of faith's pudding is discovered when a life oriented by this basic trust yields certain kinds of fruit, when it enhances human flourishing and combats death and destruction. Hart's epistemology, or understanding of knowledge, then, is entirely biblical, taken straight from Matthew 7, verse 20. By their fruits shall ye know them. Hart proceeds by way of an extreme example in order to illustrate the profound distance he sees between faith and belief as he understands it. Hart asks us to imagine an alternative medical practitioner who tries to persuade AIDS patients that there is a new drug that can cure them. After giving a long speech, the practitioner writes the name of the drug on the blackboard and implores those in attendance, in spite of their doubts and for their own lives' sake, to believe that this drug will cure them. Hart continues, and I quote, "A patient who was in the audience does believe it. 3 months later, the patient sues the practitioner as nothing has happened. The practitioner asks, 'How long have you taken the drug?' Patient, 'Taken the drug? No, you said we needed to believe that it will cure us. You said nothing about buying it or taking it." End quote. For Hart, something similar happens when we only believe that Jesus has risen, or that he is God's Son, or that he forgives sin. Such intellectual assent, he thinks, stops short of taking these truths into our lives, incorporating or incarnating them, and thus letting them truly steer or orient us. Don't simply believe that the Lord is good, one almost hears Hart say. Taste and see. Well, moving as such testimony might be, Hart's position leaves things hopelessly vague for us philosophers of religion. Do not our ongoing efforts to judge between good and bad fruit rely on effective communal dialogue and inquiry? Dialogue and inquiry in which we employ precisely defined concepts? If we are to incorporate and pass along a faith-filled view of the world to future generations, do we not rely on our ability to learn the beliefs that, at least in part, constitute a particular religious tradition? Hart would not disagree entirely with those who answer these questions affirmatively, but he would be quick to add that learning and incorporating a particular religious faith is more like acquiring a skill than it is like acquiring a belief. But there's the rub. For what happens when, with Sweet, one does not understand faith as otherwise than beliefs, but rather understands beliefs otherwise than the way Hart understands them? That is, what if beliefs are not simply or only cognitive or descriptive propositions or forms of intellectual assent, i.e. beliefs that such and such is the case, but rather form a crucial part of the uniquely human linguistic capacity that runs integrally throughout and as such is not able to be peeled away from everything we do? As I mentioned earlier, Sweet considers belief to carry not only a cognitive or descriptive dimension, but also expressive and practical dimensions. In this vein, Sweet defines religious belief as, and I quote, "the particular utterances of believers which they use to express, practice, or describe their faith," end quote. Interestingly, by drawing attention to the way we use beliefs to do various things, Sweet's philosophy of language is closer to that of Wittgenstein's than that of the so-called Wittgensteinian fideist Hart. As Wittgenstein tells us in section 43 of the Philosophical Investigations, and I quote, "For a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus: the meaning of a word is its use in the language," end quote. Like Wittgenstein, Sweet notices that we do not employ language only to describe the world, but we also employ language to express ourselves and even to engage in various sorts of other practices, including the various practices that issue from the life of faith. It is important to note, moreover, that these practices, while not reducible to the activity of holding cognitive beliefs, cannot be understood non-linguistically. That is, to consider the practices apart from the uses of language that come with them also denatures them. We can look to Wittgenstein's so-called private language argument in his philosophical investigations in order to illustrate what I mean by saying that language, and thus conceptuality and belief, is interwoven in everything we do as mature humans. In section 242, Wittgenstein asks how words refer to sensations. Wittgenstein's use of the word refer is confusing here because he does not think that the words we have for sensations, words like pain, bitter, loud, etc., are simply cognitive or descriptive labels that we use to attach to these experiences. In these and other cases, he says, and I quote, the connection between the name and the thing named, end quote, is set up differently than by simply attaching the name as a label to the thing named. In order to discover what more is involved, Wittgenstein thinks we must ask ourselves how we come to learn the meaning of the names of sensations in the first place. His simple answer to this question is that we learn the meaning of such words by learning how to use them, or learning in what context their use is appropriate. He takes the sensation of pain as his example, and I quote, words are connected with the primitive, the natural expressions of the sensation and used in their place. A child has hurt himself and cries, and then adults talk to him and teach him exclamations and later sentences. They teach the child new pain behavior. For Wittgenstein, our pain language is not simply the language of cognitive belief, i.e. the business of attaching labels to sensations, but rather a way of extending and opening up more primitive pain behavior. As such, it comes to form an integral part of our pain experience and therefore cannot be peeled off of that experience in the same way that a label can be peeled off of the thing that it labels. Wittgenstein imagines an interlocutor interjecting at this point. So, you are saying that the word pain really means crying? To which Wittgenstein responds, and I quote, on the contrary, the verbal expression of pain replaces crying and does not describe it, end quote. If Wittgenstein is right, then much, if not all, of human experience is intimately wrapped up in our linguistic practices. In the case of pain, the verbal expression is not akin to a descriptive belief that I am in pain, but rather becomes the pain behavior itself. Unlike Wittgenstein, I would prefer to say that the language extends or opens up rather than replaces the primitive behavior, for it is not the case that once we learn how to use pain language, we no longer have any need for crying, screaming, etc. Our ability to do things with words just renders these mute expressions more articulate and differentiated. So this is a long, painful philosopher's way of setting up an analogy, so I'm trying to get to the money point now. So how might Wittgenstein's example affect the way we understand religious beliefs? If we follow Wittgenstein's pain example, then in order to understand the way religious beliefs are connected to the experiences they express and become, like pain language, the religious beliefs themselves would become an integral part of the experience, we must ask ourselves how we learned the meaning of the religious language we now employ in the first place. In answering that question, of course, we must tell a story about the way in which authoritative adults acculturated us into the religious tradition that has allowed us to understand our experience in faith-filled ways. In Hart's Christian case, this story would include religious schooling, catechism, church attendance, training in the reading of Scripture, and also the experience of nature from out of the orientation this religious grounding has opened up. Yet Sweet thinks that Hart fails to credit sufficiently the tradition that has bestowed upon him the ability to experience life in this faith-filled way. According to Sweet, and I quote, faith needs to be understood as rooted in tradition, for tradition is a means by which people come to faith, through which they understand the meaning of their faith, and through which they are able to live their faith more fully. It tells us how believers have responded to the divine and is also a resource in interpreting and responding to novelty in experience, end quote. Sweet makes this remark about tradition several times because he thinks Hart fails to give tradition its due. I will return to the point about our reliance on tradition in my closing remarks. To return to Sweet's account of beliefs, including religious ones, we have seen that he thinks they play more than the cognitive or descriptive role to which Hart delimits them, although they also play that role. Accordingly, Sweet says, and I quote, "The meaning of religious beliefs can be understood only when we recognize that they have both a descriptive and an expressive dimension," end quote. That is, when religious folk utter a religious belief, they not only make a descriptive or cognitive assertion about some feature of the world, but they, quote, "also affirm other utterances implied by it and affirm the legitimacy of the interpretive framework in which the belief arises. They express, so to speak, their allegiance to such a framework in asserting the propositions that reflect it," end quote. Hart himself provides a powerful example of such expressive belief in chapter 11 of the book, entitled "Focused in Faith, the Epistemology of Faith as a Way of Knowing." His retelling in this chapter of the Lucan nativity story is profoundly moving, as are his personal reflections on his own experiences of God's presence in blue skies, sharp-shinned hawks, and even the intellectual and spiritual community he enjoyed at the Institute for Christian Studies. I'm not embarrassed to say that his faith-filled reflections in this chapter even proved capable of moving me to tears. Yet at this very moment in my reading, when I felt the tear well up in my eye and the lump rise in my throat, I stepped back in order to ponder what was then taking place in me. So that's a philosopher's disease, I'm afraid. We can't just feel what we have to feel. We have to think about what we're feeling. Here I am, I thought, just me and this book, only words and concepts as far as the eye can see. Yet through the particular way that Hank has combined these words, first into sentences, then combining the sentences into narrative, and finally the narrative into an intimate testimony of his faith, he has opened a world for me, a world that I can actually inhabit, if only momentarily. Writing in faith, Hank was able to create a text in which God could enter and become present to its reader. So while I agree with Hart that faith cannot be reduced to beliefs, if we restrict beliefs to their cognitive dimension, I see no compelling reason to restrict them in this way. Our beliefs, concepts, words, language, compose that textual texture unique to human life, and are thus part and parcel of anything we experience whatsoever. And this includes our religious experience. Another way of making this point would be to say that we find our experience as always already languaged. What would Hart's numinous religious experiences be without the clothing provided to them by the traditional religious heritage he has so thoroughly internalized? Sweet makes precisely this point with respect to Hart's position, and I think he's onto something. Can religious experience ever stand simply naked, like the inarticulate cry of an infant child? Perhaps, but surely this would be an impoverished form of that experience. Put less negatively, we might say that languaged experience is richer than raw experience and affords more possible avenues for us to respond to our experience. I'm quite sure that Hart will not readily embrace my Wittgensteinian way of conceiving beliefs otherwise, and that he would suspect that lurking somewhere within my conviction that language is interwoven throughout all human experience lies the philosopher's tendency to reduce everything to linguistic conceptuality, to have everything ultimately contained within our conceptual fists. That is not my intention, however, nor do I think that such reductionism is an implication of my philosophical views about the nature of beliefs. With Hart, I agree that all too often the philosopher's discovery is a sieve-fisted find. I also agree with him that we must let go of this desire to place everything under our conceptual control and make room in our lives for mystery, as well as the grace of revelation we experience when we let the mystery be. My Wittgensteinian understanding of language and belief, however, allows the human experience of mystery to enter into our language qua mystery. Our experience of mystery, then, does not take us to the edge of language and therefore beyond belief, as Hart seems to think. Rather, our ability to experience the mystery in language can take our language beyond the range of cognitive conceptuality, a feat that Hart actually performs in chapter 11 of this book. This fact in itself is a mystery worth pondering, for it says much about the open nature of language and of our humanity. Because Hart wants to protect such openness, he sees the religious insistence upon the centrality of cognitive belief as a dangerous form of closure. That is also why he shies away from affirming religious tradition as a sine qua non for the kind of faith he otherwise so obviously exhibits. Hart is being burned by a form of authoritarian traditionalism that seeks coercively to enforce the orthodoxy of a particular set of cognitive beliefs. And he understandably thinks that such conservative forces have denatured the very faith he so cherishes. These forces always end up affirming an antecedently existing truth or status quo that, when compared to the truth of God's promises still to come, is always an impoverished form of truth. But with peace to Hart, our beliefs are not merely the servants of that impoverished understanding of truth. To grasp this, we must ponder Paul Ricoeur's distinction between the world of the text and the world of everyday language. Put in Ricoeur's terms, Hart is mostly worried about reducing faith experience to the world of everyday language, and to draw attention to the way the texts of his religious predilection open up a possible world that gives us a critical distance from the damaged one we actually inhabit. For Ricoeur, the world of the text serves precisely to distantiate us from the world of everyday language, for the sake of making space for as yet unimagined possibility. And quoting from Ricoeur, he says, "We said that narratives, folk tales, and poems are not without a referent, but this referent is discontinuous with that of everyday language. Through fiction and poetry, new possibilities of being in the world are opened up within everyday reality. Fiction and poetry intend being, not under the modality of being given, but under the modality of power to be. Everyday reality is thus metamorphosed by what could be called the imaginative variations that literature carries out on the real." End quote. Hart wants to shelter the imaginative power that our fresh engagement with biblical literature possesses to carry out variations on the real. And that is why he holds the rationalist emphasis on the cognitive dimension of human belief under such high suspicion. For that emphasis can only see what is real and is therefore blind to what, in faith, becomes possible. Hart tells us that, quote, "Our faith depends on how we remember, read, and tell the stories of our faith. Fairy tales move from rags to riches. Faith tells of God's riches given up by a Savior in human rags. Faith always tells a different story." End quote. Without beliefs, however, it is difficult to imagine what we are doing when we remember, read, and tell the stories of our faith. Here I have simply been suggesting that beliefs are not the enemy of this project, but only the abstraction and reification of their cognitive dimension is. If we consider beliefs otherwise, as Sweet seems to want to do, perhaps we can move past the impasse in which both authors find themselves. Thank you.